Hi, Talia. Congratulations on being one of the winners of this year's contest. I really enjoyed your piece.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you came up with the idea for the story?
So the piece Overnight Shift is about an overnight shift at a homeless shelter. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I worked the overnight shift at a homeless shelter in undergrad, first as a volunteer and then eventually as a supervisor and director. And I think a lot of the questions that work prompted about how we relate to suffering, how taking care of people does or doesn't engender intimacy, and just sort of what to do in the face of both injustice and farce, to me could only be explored in fiction and especially kind of Jewish fiction. So I think that was the most direct influence probably. And then I was also taking a number of comparative religion courses at the time, looking at how different traditions sort of explored that set of questions. And through that, I came across the philosophy of Simone Weil and her kind of theory of attention and attention as prayer. And so I think that's also kind of the influence on the story.
I really liked how the protagonist, I felt you both kind of saw all the good she was doing and how, well-intentioned she was, but then you also saw a little bit of, her flaws and, how maybe she wasn't comfortable in this world entirely. How intentional were you when you were, creating this character?
I was thinking about those things. So I think I'm in a lot of my fiction and nonfiction interested in what happens when systems of care come into contact with systems of violence and how that often means that even the best intentioned, most careful people can become sort of co-conspirators in violence. And so I think, watching Leia, who's trying just so hard, get caught up in both her sort of interpersonal problems and her fraught relationship to her family and Judaism, and how that ultimately results in what might be the death of someone outside the shelter. I think yeah, so I was thinking about that, and I was also, thinking about what it means to be in your 20s and doing your best and that not being enough, and how you kind of your existence is orthogonal to all these structures of, like, you're not really a kid anymore, you're not a parent, you might not be part of an educational system anymore, you might not really have a real job yet. And so again, there's some attempt to empathize with her, but also be critical of the ways she's immature and not fully formed yet.
Were there any writers, either contemporary or from the past, that you drew on for inspiration when you were writing the story?
I think so there are a couple writers of specifically short fiction that I was inspired by, both in their form and content. The one who comes to mind first is Allegra Goodman, who I think maybe judged this contest in a previous year, and she's sort of, even when I was a really little kid, loved her writing, both in how kind of thoroughly but unobtrusively Jewish it is, and also how both literary and accessible it is. And she has a short story that I think was in the New Yorker maybe 10-15 years ago called La Vita Nuova. And it similarly is about a young woman and who's a little bit older than Leia, but is reflecting on the kind of decay and disintegration of her engagement with her fiance, and at the same time is in charge of taking care of this little boy. And it's set in the Boston area, which is where my story is loosely set, although it's not named. But so looking at how she integrated the uh, inner life of the woman with the outside world, in this kind of close third person perspective, I was inspired by that. And then I think the second writer who comes to mind is Ben Lerner, who's probably my favorite contemporary American poet and novelist. And again, he has a short story called Cafe Loop that, yeah, maybe you're familiar, but it sort of towards the end becomes this kind of flight. I don't know how else to describe it. And I sort of at the end of the story was trying to capture the exhausted but also surreal way Leia's confronting the potential death of the man outside the shelter, Tim. And the way Ben Lerner does at the end of the story, where it's this whole man choking, and at the end it seems like either he's kind of dying or he's escaped. And it's just a little bit surreal, but that makes it even more kind of visceral. I was inspired by that.
Do a lot of your stories have Jewish themes?
I was thinking about this one work by Allegra Goodman, where none of the it's set kind of post climate apocalypse, and none of the characters are Jewish because there's no acknowledged religions in this world, and yet a lot of the questions and a lot of the characters just felt very Jewish to me. And I think when I look at stuff I've written, I feel similarly, where even if it's not, there aren't explicitly Jewish characters, there's a sort of Jewish sense of humor. There's an interest in learning and argument that feels Jewish. And then I think often I like to write in conversation with whatever historians or philosophers I'm reading, and those tend to be Jewish. So I was really into like Walter Benjamin my senior year of college. And so I wrote some short fiction that had a lot of Benjaminian vibes. And similarly with, Simone Weil, that she kind of crops up, and that feels Jewish, even if I'm not, writing something set in a shtetl.
Are you working on any stories now?
Yeah, so I've been living in Glasgow working as a stained glass artist, and I'm working on the moment a stained glass piece for a shoal here. And I've been living kind of on and off with this group of modern Orthodox Jews in Scotland. And it's both the stained glass pieces of that and the sort of really lovely and fascinating diaspora community have been really generative. So I'm, working is a generous term for what I'm doing, but I'm exploring either a set of short stories or a novel kind of inspired by that setting and the work that I'm doing.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and congratulations again, Talia.
Thank you so much. Great.